What a lovely welcome. Thank you so much. I hope my voice holds out. So I would like to add my own thanks and acknowledgements to the direct owners of this land, and also all the Aboriginal people who have helped in the research I'm going to tell you about. And I find it pretty amazing that after the awful things that have been done to Aboriginal people in this country, especially like people like my ancestors, I'm a POM, you can probably tell, and yet they're willing to share their culture and stories and songs with us. So thank you, Auntie Edna, on behalf of all the Aboriginal people. So I'm going to, by the way, so this is the sort of thing I do in my day job, and over the last 10 years I've taken an interest in Aboriginal astronomy. Let me explain what I mean by that. This is Bill Mahoney, who's the senior elder of the Waterman people up in the Northern Territory, and he and I, for some years, we had a stage show called The First Astronomers, where basically I stood on stage and talked about my astronomy, and Bill stood on stage and talked about his astronomy, and we basically had a conversation on stage, and we became great mates as a result of this. And I'm going to tell you one of his stories. By the way, all the stories and things I show here, I've had permission from all the relevant owners to use them publicly. So Bill says that the Waterman people, when they die, their spirits go up to the sky. They don't just go any old hell. They actually go up, so it works. They go up through that star there, which I will call Vega, Bill will call Jalala, and that acts as a sort of porthole or wormhole into the sky. So our spirits go up into that hole there, and then they move along and up into the Milky Way, and there they do a whole load of ceremonies purifying them. And while they're up there, there's a master of ceremonies, the star I would call Altair, Bill will call Bunyan, which is the wedge-tailed eagle, and they also have a mentor, the star I would call Arcturus, and Bill would call Munin, which is the big rock cod. And during our time as a spirit in the sky, Arcturus or Munin is looking after us, making sure we go to the right place at the right time, making sure we're fed and have plenty to do and so on. So after a long period up there, after we've been through all these ceremonies, we're ready to return to the Earth. And in the Waterman culture, we return back down to the Earth as a shooting star. So when the Watermen see a shooting star coming down, they say that's somebody returning back to the Earth. And when we reach the Earth, we go to a creek, we make our way to a creek, and we wait. And while we're waiting, we're actually looked after by the big rock cod on Earth, who feeds us algae to feed us. And we wait there. And then eventually one day, our mother-to-be will come past, and our spirit jumps up into her, and she becomes pregnant, and then we're reborn as a baby. And so that's the Waterman reincarnation cycle. And I hope you agree with me, it's an incredibly beautiful story. It's much better when Bill tells it, and he puts in a lot of detail about the ceremonies as well. But is it astronomy? I would say no, it's a really beautiful story. It's not astronomy. To me, as an astronomer, astronomy is more than just telling stories about the sky. It's actually about understanding the sky, trying to understand what's going on in the sky, trying to use it for practical purposes like navigation or a calendar, things like that. And so what I'm particularly interested in is, did Aboriginal people in traditional times, did they just have these rather beautiful stories, or was there more to it than that? And that's what really interested me. Is there such a thing as Aboriginal astronomy? So did people know where objects rose or set on the sky? Did they make measurements or try to understand phenomena, or try to understand how the tides work and things like that? Okay, so to get you started, this here is an Aboriginal constellation. You get it right across Australia. It's important to the Darug people. It's important to many other people as well. It's the emu in the sky. Now, maybe I can have a show of hands. Who in this room has seen, I mean really seen, the emu in the sky? Quite a few. Those of you who haven't seen it, you've got a real treat in store for you one day. You'll see it, and it will totally blow your mind. It really will. It's the most magnificent thing. Let me say what I mean by that. So, first of all, how to find it. Actually, I'll go back. So, first of all, I'll point it out. So, next to the Southern Cross there, you can see that dark bit up there. People who have seen this remotely can't see my pointer, of course. Probably no easy way around that. To the top right is a dark circle next to those 4 bright stars of the Southern Cross, and there's a little bit sticking out to the right, which is the beak of the emu, and that's the head of the emu. And then coming down towards the centre, you can see those dark clouds and this big bulge, which is the body of the emu, and those dark lines off to the left, which are the legs of the emu. So unlike European constellations, where we sort of join the dots between the stars, this one has looked at the dark spaces between the stars, and the emu is made up of those dark spaces in the sky. Now, to see this, don't try going out into the streets of Parramatta, you won't see it. You've got to go somewhere really, really dark, up to the Blue Mountains or somewhere like that, and then and this is the right sort of time to see it. You look up at the sky, you look up at the south where there's the Southern Cross there, and you can always see that. That's the stars on the Australian flag. And then you see the dark patch next to it, and then you follow along and you'll see this great big emu. And you'll probably start off, everybody does, everybody starts by looking for something little like this. And where's that thing that Guy Norris was talking about? And suddenly you see it, and it's this great thing like this. It's this big, and it totally dominates the sky. And you think, why did I never ever see this before? This is the most magnificent thing there is in the sky. And it totally blows your mind, and you'll never forget it. You'll never see the sky the same way again. So I totally recommend that. And for those of you who haven't seen it, you've got a big treat in store for you. Okay, and if you still haven't seen it, oh, it's not going to come. There we go. And that's the shape of the emu that you're seeing. Now, around Sydney, there are many rock engravings, thousands of beautiful Aboriginal artworks like this, which are you don't hear very much about them. It's a great shame because they are fantastic art. People go to France to see the wonderful, admittedly wonderful cave paintings at Lascaux. And right on our doorstep we have possibly even older artwork, which is just as beautiful. And here you can see a man, you see it's a man, right? And a couple of wallabies there. Up in Ku-ring-gai National Park, on the Alvina track, is this emu carved into the ground, which you can see at the bottom there. And a few years ago, one of my colleagues, Hugh Cairns, suggested maybe this isn't a picture of the emu, maybe it's a picture of the emu in the sky. And part of the reason is because the shape is just like the emu in the sky. And then my son actually took this photo a few years ago, and this is actually the emu in the sky above the emu on the ground. It actually is lined up like that. So this isn't, shifted in the sky. They're not in different parts of the sky. It really is right above it like that. It lines up perfectly. And the time it lines up is when the emus lay their eggs, which is a traditional source for the people around here. And so there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but it looks very much like people were drawing pictures of the sky. There's other examples as well around Australia. So one of my questions was, did people draw pictures of the sky? Well, yes, they did. And we now think there's strong evidence that it is actually a picture of the emu in the sky. One of the bits of evidence, by the way, at this site is because this particular site is a male initiation site, and we know that the emu is associated with male initiation. And in fact, people up there timed their male initiation ceremonies when the emu in the sky was vertically above the site. That shows one of the Bora sites where they performed initiations. Okay, let's talk about some other constellations. So who knows Orion, constellation Orion? A few. Orion is very noticeable because of these 3 very bright stars. You can't see it at the moment. Later in the year you'll be able to see it in the evening. And also there's this beautiful Orion Nebula below it, which is where new stars are being born. And the reason we call it Orion is because it's named after, it's from Greek mythology. And there's this hunter who is called Orion. And those 3 stars are his belt, and the fuzzy bit below is his sword. Now there's something really wrong with this picture. Anybody like to shout out what's wrong with it?
It's upside down.
Upside down, exactly right. And so this was how Orion looks in Greece, but from here he looks like that. And so you might say, well, in fact, even if you're living in Europe, it's a bit of a stretch of imagination to turn those few stars into a Greek hunter. But in Australia, it's even harder to turn those few stars into an upside-down Greek hunter. You know, it's not the first thing that springs to mind when you see those stars, which is why people in Australia often call it the saucepan instead. Right? Who knows the saucepan? Many, not everybody, right? And the saucepan is good because it's the right way up. Maybe a little less romantic than Orion, but of course people in Australia have been here for 50,000 plus years, and many Aboriginal groups have names for it as well. And I'll just tell a couple of those stories now. So the Yolngu people up in Arnhem Land call it Julpan, and they have many stories about it. Everybody's got lots of stories about it. One of their stories is that the 3 stars, in the 3 bright stars there, are 3 brothers. And they went fishing and hunting, and they couldn't catch anything. All they could catch were kingfish. And unfortunately, these brothers were from the kingfish clan, which means they're not allowed to eat kingfish. It's a bit like eating your grandfather, you know, yucky and illegal. So they were throwing the kingfish back as they should. And eventually, one of them got so hungry, he caught and ate a kingfish. And this was a terrible crime. And the son, Walu, his female, she saw this and created a water spout that blew them up into the sky, and you can see them there in their canoe with the bright stars front and back, and the nebulas, the fish that they caught, still on the line. And again, when you see it, it looks so much more convincing than an upside-down Greek hunter. And it's much better actually than a saucepan. And so next time you see the saucepan, try to picture that canoe. You'll see these bright stars at the front and the back, and it really does look, again, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. Orion to me always looks like a canoe now. It's much better than the saucepan or upside down Greek hunters. Okay, near to Orion are this beautiful cluster of stars called the Pleiades, 7 sisters, and again that's from Greek mythology. They were 7 beautiful sisters, and Orion was in love with them, or in love with one of them, but of course they're upside down again, they're Greek, and when you look at the Pleiades, they don't really look like 7 upside down Greek girls, but they are a beautiful cluster of stars, and in many Aboriginal cultures, probably most Aboriginal cultures, they're called the 7 sisters. By the way, you read in some books that Aboriginal people can't count beyond 5, which begs the question, how come everybody calls them the 7 sisters? It's a complete myth, this business about not counting beyond 5. So this is a story from a Yolngu lady who's sadly passed away. But she says 7 sisters come back each year with turtle, fish, snakes, and bush foods like yam. And when we Yolngu people see them, we know those foods are in season, and so we know to go and get the food. And so another question I asked earlier was, were the stars used for practical purposes? Well, here we see a really practical purpose. And you might say, well, but why do people need the stars to tell them? Can't they just look at the berries and see when the berries are ready and things like that? Well, it's not so simple, because if you live up in Arnhem Land, you actually cycle through the year. You go in a cycle of camps, and you need to be up on the escarpment at the right time when the berries are coming out, otherwise all the birds eat them. And you need to get down to the rivers to get the barramundi when the barramundi come in. And they eat water chestnuts, they call aika, which they have to pull out of the ground before the magpies keep getting them. So actually a calendar is really, really important to the Yolngu people, and they use the stars to, what is one of the things to regulate their calendar. So they are being used for that practical purpose as well. Here's another story about the 7 sisters, and it's from a man from the Koima people in the Northern Territory. And he says, you see that model of stars, that he's talking about Orion. You see the canoe there, by the way, the 2 bright stars. We blackfellows call him Man Book, and all day he chases that mob of girls over there, and that's the 7 sisters. And that's interesting. This is the same story as we heard from the Greek mythology, and we find all across Australia that Orion, what I would call Orion, or Man Book, or Julpan, is almost always a group of boys or young men or a young man, just like the Greek mythology, and the girls, the seven sisters, are nearly always a group of girls. And there's lots and lots of stories about the boys in Orion trying to catch the girls in the seven sisters, and there's a lot more about that, which I can't go into here, but it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so in most Aboriginal cultures, the sun is female. In Yolngu, she's called Walu. She gets up each morning in the east, sets fire to a stringbark tree, and carries it across the sky, giving us light and heat. So a lovely old lady. And then she gets to her camp in the west and puts out her fire. Oh, she decorates herself with red ochre, by the way, which is why we get these beautiful sunrises and sunsets. And she takes off in the evening, spills some on the clouds, and then makes her way during the night back to her camp in the east. The moon is a male in most cultures, and there's lots of stories. He's generally a bad man, unlike Walu, he's bad. And so a typical story, you see the phase of the moon, over the course of a month, the moon goes from a thin crescent to the full moon, back to a thin crescent, and then goes dark for 3 nights. And a typical story, again a Yolngu story, is that Nyalindi, as he's called in Yolngu, he was a really lazy, fat man, and he refused to help get any food or anything like that, didn't help with the housework, didn't really wash up. And his wives and sons attacked him with axes, as he would in that situation. And so big, fat, round Nyalindi in the middle there gradually got bits hacked off him, so he became thinner and thinner and thinner, and he died. And he was, when he's dead, he's the new moon, he's dark, you can't see him, and he stayed dead for 3 nights. Then he came back to life again and keeps going through the cycle. But he was so angry about this that he cursed the earth. He said, from now on, if I die, I'm going to come back to life. But anybody else who dies, they stay dead. And so he was the person who brought death to the world. That's why we call boo and hiss when we hear about Nyalindi. I've said all that. What about eclipses? Who here's seen a solar eclipse? Wow, lots. Isn't it the most fantastic sight? It really gets you in a really visceral way. So let me just talk about very quickly how a solar eclipse works. So what happens? We're standing on the Earth there, looking at the sun, middle of the day, and the moon, as it moves across the sky, gets between us and the sun, and everything goes dark. And then as our eyes get adjusted, we see this beautiful light around the sun. It's a really beautiful sight. And it feels very strange. I think it's absolutely built into our genes, our reaction to this. So we can ask, what are the Aboriginal understandings of the eclipses? There's a lovely story. There's a lady called Mrs. Peggs in about 1900 in Western Australia, and she was very interested in the local culture. And she received this letter from England telling her that there would be a total solar eclipse in her area in a few weeks' time. And so she asked to speak to one of the local elders and through an interpreter. And she said, I just heard that in a few weeks' time, in the middle of the day, the sun is going to go dark, it will get very dark, very cold, all the birds will fly back to the trees, the dogs will bark, we'll have strange shadows on the ground and strange cold winds. And what do you think about that? And the elder said, what, you mean like a solar eclipse? Or what it was in this language. And of course people have been here for 70,000 years, and they've seen lots of solar eclipses come and go. So it's not surprising that people know about them. But actually it is surprising, if you think about it more, that if you stand in one place, you will only see a total solar eclipse maybe once every 8 generations. So the chances are, unless you travel to see one, you will never see a total solar eclipse. Neither with your children, or your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren, or your great-great, and so on. Until you get to great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, they might see one. And that's how rare they are. So how come people know about solar eclipses. You get stories passed down the generations. So as an Aboriginal man, I've heard this story from my great-great-great-grandfather, and I choose to pass it on to my grandchildren, my great-great-great-grandchildren, even though I've never seen one, and yet it's of importance that these stories get passed on through the generations. And it's a tremendous testament to the way that Aboriginal knowledge gets passed on through the generations, that stories like this do survive. Anyway, as we go around Australia, we find different versions of this story. A common one is that an eclipse happens when the sun woman and the moon man make love, and so the body of one covers the other. But that's exactly what a solar eclipse is. This is a correct scientific explanation. Okay, in science we don't generally talk about the moon man and the sun woman, but otherwise it's right. And you can see from things like this that there have been Aboriginal people over thousands of years looking up at the sky, seeing phenomena in the sky, and trying to figure out what's going on, and coming up with an explanation like this. And you see these explanations coded into the songs and stories. And I call this ethnoscience, right? So it's the same as what scientists do. We try to come up with explanations of what's going on that's consistent with our information. Now, okay, nowadays we wouldn't talk about the sun woman and the moon man, but given the information available to them, this is a perfectly reasonable explanation. I'll show more examples of this. So, eclipses were understood. Let's talk about tides. So you know how tides work. You go to the sea and every day the sea level goes up and down. It goes up and down twice a day by typically a metre or something. And what you may not be aware, unless you're a sailor, is that the height of that tide varies in different times of the year. So if we look, I'm sorry about graphs, not everybody likes graphs. If you don't like graphs, shut your eyes, it will go away in a minute. And just ignore it, you won't really miss much. But what happens is that sometimes the year, the water is going up and down by about 2 metres every day. And a few weeks later, suddenly you're going up and down by a little bit. And if you look at the moon, you realise that when it's going up and down by a large amount, that's either the full moon or the new moon. When it's only going up and down by a little bit, that's when you've got a quarter moon, or crescent moon. And so these tides actually depend on the phase of the moon. Okay, why do I say Galileo versus the Yolngu? I'm going to talk about two different explanations of this fact. So Galileo, who's a great scientist, we all know he's maybe the father of modern science, lived about 400 years ago. But like everybody, he had a bad day. And his bad day was when he came up with the explanation of the tides. And I'm not even going to talk about his explanation. He had a thing about where the water was splashing around the Earth, and it is completely wrong. And Galileo should have realised it was wrong, because his model only gave you one tide a day. Galileo should have realised this is not good science. If you have a model which explains tides and only gives you one tide a day, and every fisherman, every sailor knows it goes up and down twice a day, your model's wrong. And the other thing is that people say, oh, I think it's something to do with the moon. And Galileo said, no, it's nothing to do with the moon. That's a lamentable piece of mysticism, or whatever that is in Italian. And not in an English accent. So anyway, Galileo, totally wrong. And it wasn't any use. His model of the tides didn't tell you anything. You couldn't use it at all. I'd heard that there were some excellent Yolngu stories about the tides. This is us. Actually, that's just a segue to show this photo. It's a beautiful photo. This is us going around trying to find somebody who can tell us about the tides. We're crossing a creek there in our rental car, and that creek is absolutely full of crocodiles. This is on the Arnhem Highway, and you really don't want to stall the engine in the middle of that creek. I think you're going to have to battle the crocodiles to get out. But anyway, the Yolngu story is okay, they're on the east coast of Australia, right? And they have these beautiful blue seas and clear skies. And so they see the moon coming up through the horizon, going up in the sky, and then going back over the land. And their explanation is, as the moon comes up through the ocean, it fills up with water. Water pours into the moon. in the ocean. And when you've got a full moon, that's because a whole load of water is going into the moon. And when you've got a new moon, that's because a whole load of water has just come out. And when you've got a crescent moon or half moon, that's because only a little bit of water has gone in and out. And that's why you get really big tides at the new moon and full moon, and you only get little tides at the half moon. And you might say, okay, well that's a bit different from the modern scientific explanation, which is about gravitational forces and the sun and the moon lining up and things like this. But the point is, it's useful. It works. Given the information that is available to these guys, it's actually a perfectly good explanation of how the tides work. And so if I was in Arnhem Land 100 years ago, I could go up to a young new person and say, so what are the tides going to be doing tonight? And they'd say, oh, well, the moon's up there, so the tide will be coming up to full tide quite soon. It's full moon, so it's going to be a very big tide. So they've got useful information out of their story, whereas Galileo couldn't do that. So, right. So this is what I mean about ethnoscience. You understand that it is like science, but of course they didn't have telescopes and things. But based on the information they had, it's a really good explanation. And it works, and it has predictive power. Okay, so I hope I've shown you, yes, there really was Aboriginal astronomy. People really were understanding the sky, trying to use it for practical purposes, and so on. So what about navigation? It's very curious that we've known for a very long time that Aboriginal people traded stuff across Australia. This is actually from a paper in 1939 showing some of the trade routes in Australia. So even back in 1939, people knew that people from South Australia were trading up to people in the Northern Territory. So you find knives from South Australia being used in the Northern Territory, and ochre from the Northern Territory being used in South Australia, and so on, and all the way across Australia. Not just artifacts and things like ochre, but songs and stories were traded as well in ceremonies. So it's very, people have this idea, nobody in this room actually, but a few white people have this idea that, primitive Aboriginal people running around, scratching a living from the ground. No, it wasn't like this. There's this fantastic civilization with people of learning, trying to understand their world around them, and having great trade routes and things like this. Anyway, what I find strange is that although anthropologists in the 1930s were describing these, nobody asked, how did they navigate? And I have no idea why they didn't ask. I think it's a cultural thing. The anthropologists at the time didn't think that's a good question to ask. But anyway, they didn't. And now we ask this question, well, how did people navigate? They must have been really good navigators if they did all this. And so some of us have been looking at this question. So this is one example. A colleague, Dwayne Hammaker, and I, a few years ago, we looked at stone arrangements in New South Wales. And we don't actually know what these stone arrangements are for. There's some ceremonial purpose that we don't know about. But it was said that these things were often north-south. And we thought we'd test that hypothesis, actually make a, pardon me, apologise for my voice. We thought we'd survey a whole load of these to see if they really did go north-south. And as you can see on those pictures on the right, those maps, north is up, and quite a few of them do go north-south, not all of them, but quite a lot of them. When we plotted a graph, again, shut your eyes if you don't like graphs, it will go away. We made a histogram of all the bearings of all the stone roads, and 0 is north-south. And you can see a whole load of them, that great big pile there, are north-south. And you see another great pile at east-west. And there's another whole load which are all over the place. The significance of this, okay, that's interesting, they are north-south and so on. But what's really interesting is that the width of these bins is 5 degrees. So when people put their stone row north-south, they did it very accurately, with an accuracy of 5 degrees. You can't do that just by estimation. I mean, if I say to you, okay, where's west? Many people might look at where the sun sets and say, over there. No, wrong. The sun can set anywhere from northwest to northeast. Sorry, Start again. Sun can set anywhere from the southwest to northwest. It can be anywhere over a wide range. And it isn't just at west. So how would you measure west? Well, get out your compass or GPS. A few hundred years ago, you couldn't do that. And actually, it's really, really hard. And the only way you can actually do it is by observing the sky, making actually careful measurements of the sky. So what you can do is see where the sun sets each day throughout a year, and all these points on the horizon where it sets, and you take the midpoint of all those places, and that is west. And that's one way of doing it. So certainly, you know, Aboriginal people 1,000 years ago certainly had technology in their brains, and apparently they did it, because there's no other way they could have done that. This shows indirectly that people are making measurements of the sky. That's the only way you can do that. So do we see any other evidence for that? Well, I'm sure there would have been lots of sites like this a few hundred years ago, but I only know of one site. It's a place called Wurdi Youang in Victoria. I was actually down there yesterday, in fact, making a TV programme about it for National Geographic. It's a big stone circle, maybe 50 metres across, and it was built by the Wathaurong people probably thousands of years ago. We don't actually have a date. So if you look from the air, this is what it looks like, and you see this big ring of stones about 50 metres across. It's not actually a circle, it's more like a kite shape with a round bit at the end. And there it is, you haven't seen it. And at the top, these three very large stones. They're sort of like the focal point of this stone arrangement. And when you look over those three stones, you see these three hills in the distance, which they seem to mimic. But what's really interesting is if you look through these stones at the equinox, you see you're looking over these other little stones we call outliers. You see these other little stones in the grass there. And they seem to be set up so that the left-hand one is right underneath where the sun sets on Midsummer's Day. And the right-hand one is underneath where the sun sets on Midwinter's Day. And the ones in the middle, there's a little line of three of them, and they're underneath where the sun sets at the equinox, halfway between those. And, well, that's interesting. It's a bit like Stonehenge in England, which has big stones set up to mark these directions. And so the question is this real, I guess? So it looks like this was built to observe the position of the suns on those dates. And incidentally, that one in the middle, that is exactly east-west, very accurately. People have built it, have got it much better than a degree. Could it be an accident? Could it be that it's us white guys projecting our views or wishful thinking on an Aboriginal stone arrangement, which is actually something else completely? We did a whole load of measurements, and we actually surveyed the whole stone circle, and we found that these special directions towards the sunset in those days wasn't just those little stones there, but actually the whole stone circle as a whole. It's got these, I said it looks like a kite shape from the air. It's got two sort of straightish lines, and those two big lines actually point towards where the sun sets on Midsummer's Day and Midwinter's Day. And we ran a whole load of computer models to see if this could happen by accident, and the answer is no, not in a million years. It must have been built for this purpose. There's no way you'd get that by chance. And so we're now, after a lot of work, we're now pretty certain that the people who built this stone arrangement deliberately built it, the Wathaurong people built it specifically to point towards where the sun sets on Midwinter's Day, Midsummer's Day, and the solstices. We don't know what they used it for, by the way. Unfortunately, the Wathaurong people were the usual story. The kids were sent to mission schools. They're forbidden to speak their language or pass on their culture, and so we don't actually know. We don't have any folk memories about how it was used. All we've got is the story that the stones are telling us. And so we're doing a whole load of work in this, working with the traditional owners. I'll show you a, oops, oh dear, I'm there. It's an animation. It hasn't survived the shift from Mac to PC, I'm afraid. That's right. So if you stand at the bottom there and look along those lines, you're looking towards where the sun sets on Midwinter's Day. So we now have evidence that Aboriginal people thousands of years ago, they were certainly capable of measuring bearings very accurately. We can see how they did it. We can see evidence they did do it all around the country. And how did they use it for navigation? So I'll go back to my mate Bill Harney, and these some quotes from him. Each night when we were going to travel back to the camp, the only tell was about a star. How to travel? Follow the star along. Bill is an amazing person. I'm actually paid to be an astronomer. Actually, I sit in front of a computer terminal all the time. If you ask me to name stars in the sky, I'm not very good at it actually. Maybe name 20, 30 or something like that. Most amateur astronomers can do better than that. Bill can name about 5,000. So as being an Aboriginal elder, what it means is that ever since he was a kid, living in a traditional Aboriginal community, he's had this enormous education all the time as a kid, all the way through adolescence, right until middle age. He's spending almost every waking hour of every day learning stuff, learning stories and songs from his elder, learning the sky. But you can point to any star and Bill will name it. And Bill carries this intuitive mental map of the sky around with him in his head. That I would go around, I'd say, oh yeah, okay, there's Orion, there's yeah, I reckon south would be about there. Bill just said, that's south. And he doesn't even have to think about it. it's just part of the information he immediately gets from looking at the sky without any conscious effort. And there's other examples there of how he navigates. So Bill uses these directions to navigate. There's other ways that people can navigate. I'm just going to go on a slight detour, and we ask another science question. Why is Venus always low in the sky? So if you look up at the Venus, the evening star at the moment, you see this really bright star in the sky, but you only ever see it in the evening, and it's just low over where the sun has just set, or you see it in the morning, and it's low in the sky, just where the sun will rise. He said, well, why don't we ever see it up there? You don't. And we now know with science that, okay, it's because it is up there actually, but the sun is also up there at the same time. Venus is always close to the sun because it's on an orbit close to the sun. And so the sun's just too bright to see it up there. So we always see it down there. Okay, what about the Yolngu story? The Yolngu call Venus Barnabia, and they say she has creator spirit. She came from the east and she brought the first humans to Australia. And she arrived at this sacred place called Yarrapay. And what happens is that people are coming to Australia by boat, in a small boat, and she said she would lead them so they didn't get lost. So she flew up in the sky from her island of Barnabia and started flying along. But her sisters were worried that she'd get lost. And so they tied a rope to her to stop her flying too high in the sky. That's why Venus is always low in the sky. So that's the only explanation. So every question you can ask about the sky, somebody has an explanation for it, like that. Anyway, what happened with Venus Barnabia is that she continued flying along. She crossed the coast at Yarrapay, flew across the land, and she sang this song as she went. And this is a few words from it. But the song is very long. During the Barnabia ceremony, which starts in the evening at sunset, it goes on right through the night till the morning, till Venus and the sunrise in the morning. And it's not just about, this is the beginning of it. Later on, she describes the mountains she's flying over, the land she's flying over. She describes where the good camping places are, where the waterholes are, where the boundaries between different clans are. And in doing so, she's actually describing an oral map of the countryside. So if you want to navigate, if you want to travel west from the coast in Arnhem Land, you just have to know the words of this song. And you'll be traveling along, you see a mountain there. Do I go to the left or the east or to the right of that? And you remember Barnabia, she said, oh, to the west is a horrible swamp, you don't want to go there. And to the right is a good hunting ground and there's a nice waterhole, so you go to the right. And so Venus has given you this old map of the sky. And we call these things song lines. And the whole country is covered by song lines. And we now know those big navigation routes I showed earlier, most of those are song lines. I'll give you some examples, more examples in a minute. We have this morning star ceremony. This is Gali on Elcho Island dancing the morning star ceremony. And you see he's got this morning star pole which he's pointing at Venus. And there's a tuft of feathers on top of it, magpie goose feathers. That represents Venus. And through it, he's communicating with Barnabia. And she's actually able to communicate with the ancestors living on this island of Baralku through this rope that's holding her down. It's also this beautiful ceremony that goes all night. So I said to one of my younger friends that, well, you know, it's a beautiful story, but one big hole in it, there's no rope. He said, yeah, there's a rope underneath you. You look hard, you see a rope. No. I'm an astronomer, I know about these things, you know. I used to help us place telescope and things like that. If there's a rope there, we would have seen it. He said, you don't look hard enough. So next morning we're out there 4 o'clock in the morning watching Venus, and this is an actual photo. And I don't know whether you can see the rope. Just photoshopped a bit. And I'd totally forgotten. Okay, it's not actually a rope. There's this glow of light, and we call it zodiacal light. And it's caused by dust in the plane of the solar system being lit up by the sun. And so underneath Venus, yes, there is actually a rope. And so, there you go. The young are doing pretty well on this. You get lots of other songlines. This is we've done lots of work with the URLI people and the URLI people, particularly with Michael Anderson, who's an elder of the URLI people. And he's told us about many songlines. This is one of them, going from, so he and his clan can sing a song which will take you from Carnarvon Gorge down through Rowan and Stewart in Queensland down to Gaduga, which is the URLI homeland. And what's really interesting about this one, they mapped it onto the sky. Those are the stars of Scorpius. And instead of mapping it on the land, they can point to the stars in the sky and say this is how you travel along. Now they don't actually use the stars for navigation, but they use the stars to remind them of the song. So kids will learn the song going from star to star in the sky, and then they can apply it to the land. And so they have these song lines going all over Eastern Australia, which they will map onto different parts of the sky. Bill Harney tells us about song lines. He says, you sing a song, then you follow your song, in that track you go on singing the song like a blazed mark, like following a series of signposts. This song line tells you how to travel. And Bill tells the story of when he's a little boy, and there's his family. Fortunately, we actually have a photo of his family when he was a little kid. And his grandfather, Joe Jamoni, was asked by the whitefellas at the time, could he be a navigator? They wanted to navigate from Catherine through to the west into WA, and his father agreed to show them the way. And so his grandfather, was walking along singing this song, which Bill will still sing, and little Bill, as this little kid, walking along next to his grandfather, being led by the hand and learning the song and learning the roots. And behind them, so it'd be his grandfather and Bill walking along singing the song, and behind them would be the whitefellas who are blazing the trees with knives, marking the routes, and behind them would be the 1930s equivalent of a bulldozer, which is a great big log being pulled along by bullocks, flattening all the saplings along the way and flattening the trail. And that's how they built the Victoria Highway. So next time you drive along the Victoria Highway from Catherine to Gunnoa, you remember that Bill and his grandfather blazed the routes for that using a songline, and you're walking along a Waterman songline. You don't have to go that far. Around here we have plenty of songlines, and in fact the Great Western Highway from Sydney up to the Blue Mountains is a direct songline. I'm sure the people here know much more about it than I do, but along the way these direct carvings go right up into the Blue Mountains, showing the trail. I'm going to finish there. If you want more, there is this book. I can wave a copy around, but I don't have any here, but so you can buy them off the web there, and I'll have more about what things I've talked about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. That was fascinating. Does anyone have any questions? Now, I'm conscious we have our partners at Children's Hospital on video link, so we'll get some questions from this side first, and then if there's any questions from the Children's Hospital, we'll ask for me. So does anyone have a question for Ray?
Just a question, Ray, about the stone kites. I wondered if you've done any dating on
So the question is about the dating of the stone arrangements. The answer is we try to. It's just really, really hard. So what you'd really like is some like radiocarbon dates. You can't do those with stones. You have to use thermoluminescence, which is a much harder technique, much less accurate. And we're actually in the process of trying to get approvals to do a big study to... Oops, sorry, that's me. Yes, we're in the process of actually trying to get approvals to do that, so maybe sometime soon. It's very frustrating because we don't actually know how old this is. We know it's at least 200 years old, and we know it's less than 70,000. Other than that, we don't know. But the amazing thing is that clearly it's built for doing astronomy, amongst other things probably. But we know the oldest astronomers in the world, the first astronomers, or people think of Stonehenge, it's 5,000 years old, or the pyramids, which are even younger. But there's a good chance that's thousands of years old, because we know that's how old the culture is. And nearby there is a site which has been dated at 14,000. If people really did build it, then that means the Aboriginal Australians were the world's first astronomers, which would be rather nice.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Do you know anything about the star Sirius? I've seen a show on in relation to it's been carved into some rock somewhere. Do you know anything about that?
Not sure exactly.
In the same vein that you were.
Yeah. So in fact, Sirius, I gave a shorter version of that story. Sirius, in some groups, they say Sirius is a dog that belongs to the girls in the Seven Sisters, and they use the dog to try to ward off Orion. I don't know of any carvings of it.
Yeah, there's a documentary on quite a few years ago where that system is actually carved in stone somewhere in Australia.
So I don't know. I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. They're beautiful stories from the north and from the east, and just a little snippet about the eclipse from the west. But I'm wondering, do you have any stories from the Yamaji in Western Australia?
That's interesting you mentioned the Yamaji. So on my first slide, I showed the picture of a big new telescope we're building in Western Australia, which is in Yamaji land. And so we're working very closely with them. We have a very good relationship with the Yamaji people, and they're very supportive of the telescope, better than mines. And so we're talking about, I guess, like, we'd love to make a collection of their stories. Yes, they do have stories, and they produce wonderful paintings, and there's lovely paintings of the Emu in the sky and things. We hope, as part of our collaboration with them, that we will publish a collection of Yamaji stories. There are certainly lots of stories from over there, but not ones that I yet have permission to talk about.
Any more questions from here? Oh, after that.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. I just had one question. Do you have any views on the proposed Egyptian hieroglyphs in Carryong near Gosford?
Yes. I don't think they're real. I mean they're real engravings, but I don't think there's any evidence. I mean, the trouble is, as I was saying, it's very difficult to date this stuff, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and without some dating or something like that, we've no evidence that they're actually very old. They could be a modern day hoax, for all I know. And I can't say they're fake. I don't have the evidence to say they're fake. All I can say is we don't know, and I'm not going to take them very seriously until we do have some strong evidence in support of them.
Okay, I've got another question over here.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that. I thought that was so helpful for us to understand that, you know, our long-term Indigenous people from way back have had this scientific approach to living, if you like. And I'm wondering whether the same sort of work is done with other Indigenous people around the planet. You know, do we look at that, you know, how science was used by ancient Indigenous folk?
Yes. Aboriginal people are not alone. Lots of work. Well, in Britain, where I come from, there's lots of work on Bronze Age societies. There's a big difference, though, that, you know, Bronze Age people a long time ago, there's no real link with the past. I mean, in some sense, I'm an Aboriginal Brit, but I have no cultural link with the Bronze Age people. Whereas here we have a living culture, and what we're seeing are parts of that living culture. That's also true in the United States and Canada as well, and there's similar work going on there. The cultures are very different, of course, but similar sorts of things go on, and we know that the Native Americans were also really interested in understanding how the sky works, including medicine wheels and so on.
I believe in Machu Picchu it has a similar thing.
Yeah.
Point out the sunset between the buildings.
That's right. Yeah, in Machu Picchu there's fantastic stuff like that. So all around the planet you find Indigenous people trying to understand the sky. But given the culture here, maybe the Aboriginal people are doing it first.
Okay, now this is a bit of an experiment. Have we got any questions from the Children's Hospital at Westmead? We'll take that as a no, or we can't hear them. And I do apologise if we can't hear you. We'll try to see if we can get some questions through to Ray later, if there is any questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray. That was fascinating.